The morning Theresa Sutton called Clement Holloway impossible for the first time. She had a cast-iron skillet in one hand, a bucket of well water in the other, and absolutely no patience left in her entire body. It was the spring of 1874, and the town of Harrow Creek, Texas, sat baking under an April sun that had already forgotten what mercy felt like. Harrow Creek was the kind of town that existed in spite of itself. A general store, a sheriff's office that doubled as the town's only jail, a livery stable run by a man named Porties who smelled permanently of horse liniment, a church with a leaking roof, and a boarding house operated by Theresa Sutton with the iron determination of a woman who had buried a husband, survived a drought, and raised a daughter entirely on her own by the time she was 26 years old. She was 28 now. With copper-brown hair she twisted up every morning before sunrise, dark eyes that missed nothing, and hands that were strong and capable and occasionally trembling with exhaustion at the end of a long day. She was not a woman who asked for much from the world. She asked for her roof to hold. She asked for her boarders to pay on time. She asked for her daughter, Lily, who was 7 years old and curious as a hound dog about everything, to stay out of the mud on laundry day. The world did not always cooperate on any of those points. But nothing, not a leaking roof, not a late boarder, not Lily tracking creek mud through the front hall, had prepared Theresa Sutton for the arrival of Clement Holloway. He arrived on a Thursday, which Theresa had always considered the most unreliable day of the week, riding a bay horse that looked too fine for a man who appeared to have slept in the open air for the past 3 nights. He was tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, wearing a worn canvas coat that had seen better decades, and a hat that had been punched back on his head at an angle suggesting he thought rules about hat wearing were largely optional. He had dark hair curling at the back of his neck, jaw dark with stubble, and eyes the color of the hills after a good rain, a kind of gray-green that was difficult to look away from if you made the mistake of looking directly into them, which Theresa made immediately and regretted shortly thereafter. He asked politely enough about a room. She quoted him the rate. He agreed without argument, which immediately made her suspicious. In her experience, men who agreed to the rate without argument either had more money than they appeared to, or were planning to leave before anyone noticed they had none. He paid 2 weeks in advance in actual coin, which addressed one concern while doing nothing for the other. His name, he told her, while carrying his own saddlebag up the stairs with that easy, unhurried manner of his, was Clement Holloway. He was a horse breeder and trainer passing through on his way to a ranch operation near San Angelo, where he had contracted work for the season. He would be in Harrow Creek, he estimated, for 3 to 4 weeks while he recovered a string of horses he had been hired to locate and return to their rightful owner, an occupation that was legal, he added, glancing back at her over his shoulder on the staircase, in case the look on her face suggested she was wondering. The look on her face had, in fact, been suggesting exactly that. "Rooms at the end of the hall," she said. "Breakfast is at 6:30. If you miss it, you miss it. Supper is at 6 in the evening. Same rule applies. I do not run a restaurant and I do not take special orders, and if you track mud across my floors, I will know it was you because you are the only boarder I currently have who walks like he owns whatever ground he is standing on." He had stopped on the staircase and turned fully to look at her then, and there it was, that smile. It was not a smirk, which she would have found easy to dislike. It was something quieter and more genuine, the kind of smile that started at the corners of the eyes rather than the mouth, as though whatever he was feeling was too real to be performed. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I will watch the mud." He did not watch the mud, not the first morning nor the second. By the 3rd morning she was waiting at the bottom of the stairs with a mop and an expression that could have cured leather. "You are impossible," she told him, pointing at the dark trail of boot prints across her clean floor. He looked at the boots. He looked at the floor. He looked at her, and he smiled. "I am sorry, Mrs. Sutton," he said, and took the mop from her hands and cleaned the floor himself while she stood there with her arms crossed, trying to determine whether this made things better or whether it was simply a different category of impossible. It happened the next morning, too, and the morning after that. He would come down from his room having been up since before first light. She could hear him moving around up there, quietly, as if he was trying not to wake her, but she was always already awake because the boarding house required it, and he would cross the kitchen trailing whatever the land outside had deposited on his boots, and she would say, "Clement Holloway, you are impossible," and he would smile that smile and go get the mop. By the second week she had started saying it before he even crossed the threshold. She would hear the sound of his boots on the porch steps, and she would call from wherever she was in the kitchen, "You are impossible, Mr. Holloway," and his voice would come back through the door, "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Sutton." And something in the rhythm of it had become, without her fully noticing, a kind of morning greeting that belonged only to the two of them. The thing about Clement Holloway, Theresa discovered across those first weeks, was that he was entirely unlike what he appeared to be on first examination. She had made assumptions about him, that he would be loud or careless or difficult in the specific ways that men who spent most of their lives outdoors and on horseback were sometimes difficult. He was none of those things. He was quiet in a way that was full rather than empty. He was thoughtful. He had, apparently, an extraordinary gift with horses and an equally extraordinary patience with people who were not, by nature, patient themselves. He fixed things. That was the other quality she noticed, and tried not to notice too closely. He simply fixed things. The gate latch on the yard fence that had been sticking since autumn, she came out one morning to find it swinging clean. The board on the porch step that creaked so loudly it woke her every time a boarder came in after dark. She discovered it replaced one afternoon while she was at the general store. He mentioned none of it. Just did it and went back to whatever he was doing. "You did not have to fix the latch," she said one evening, finding him at the fence watching the horses in the paddock beyond the road. "It needed doing," he said. "I would have gotten to it. I am sure you would have." He said it in a way that meant he believed it entirely, which was different from the placating agreement most men offered women who said such things. "I just got to it first." She stood beside him at the fence for a moment, watching the same horses he was watching, a group of range animals belonging to the Delacroix ranch that had drifted up to the paddock line. He watched them with a focus that was entirely unself-conscious, studying the way they moved, the way they held their heads. "Those two are lame," he said, nodding toward a pair of chestnuts standing apart from the others. "The near one has been favoring the left foreleg for about 2 days. The far one is compensating for something in the hindquarter. Has Delacroix been out here recently?" She had not noticed either of those things, and she was a woman who noticed most things. "No," she said. "He rarely comes into town himself. He sends his foreman." "Someone ought to tell the foreman then," Clement said, still watching the horses. "Left untreated, the near one will be unrideable by summer." "You could tell him yourself. The foreman comes in on Fridays for supplies." He looked at her then, and for a moment he was simply looking at her face, not past it or through it, in the way of a man who has actually seen the person he is talking to. "I could do that," he said. She looked away first and went back inside and spent the next quarter hour not thinking about the color of his eyes in the evening light. The trouble with the Rutherford men started on a Saturday at the end of Clement's second week in Harrow Creek. The Rutherford brothers, 3 of them, the oldest being a man named Dax who was somewhere north of 40 and mean as a step-ton rattlesnake, ran cattle on the dry range west of town, and had a long-standing habit of treating the town of Harrow Creek as an extension of their personal property. They had money, which in Harrow Creek in 1874 translated almost directly to a kind of unofficial authority, and Sheriff Cal Deering, who was a good enough man in circumstances that didn't require genuine courage, had a way of looking sideways when the Rutherfords were involved. What brought them to Theresa's boarding house that Saturday afternoon was a matter she had been hoping would resolve itself without her direct involvement, which it very clearly was not going to do. 3 months earlier, a widow named Pearl Haskell had come to Harrow Creek with 2 small boys and almost nothing else, having fled a situation in San Antonio that involved a debt her late husband had contracted with the Rutherford family's cattle operation. The debt was dubious in Theresa's assessment. She had seen the ledger Pearl showed her, and the numbers had been added with the creative accounting of someone who understood that a widow with 2 boys would have no legal recourse, but it was real enough in the Rutherfords' eyes. Pearl had been boarding with Theresa for 2 months, paying what she could, working in the kitchen mornings and helping with laundry, and Theresa had told no one where she was staying because she had seen immediately that there was trouble following Pearl Haskell, and she had no intention of handing the woman over to it. The Rutherfords had found out anyway. They had ways of finding things out in Harrow Creek. Dax Rutherford came to the boarding house with 2 of his men on that Saturday afternoon, not his brothers but 2 ranch hands who stood behind him the way furniture stands behind a man in a room, present and immovable and not particularly thinking for themselves. Theresa answered the door because she always answered her own door. "Dax Rutherford," she said, without any particular warmth. "Mrs. Sutton." He tipped his hat with the politeness of a man who learned the gesture without the feeling behind it. "You have a woman staying here goes by Pearl Haskell. I need to speak with her." "I have several guests," Theresa said. "I do not discuss my guests with people who are not my guests." "Now, Mrs. Sutton, this is a business matter and I would hate for it to become unpleasant." "Would you?" she said. It was not a question. She was aware peripherally of movement somewhere behind her in the house. She did not turn around. "The woman owes a debt to my family's operation," Dax said. "I am simply here to collect it or to make an arrangement about how it will be settled." "Then perhaps you might take yourself to the sheriff's office and describe the nature of your debt in legal terms, and the sheriff can advise you on how to proceed through the proper channels." Something shifted in Dax Rutherford's face. He was not a man accustomed to being redirected by women with boarding houses, and the irritation of it was visible. "I am trying to be civil," he said. "I can see that," Theresa said. "I am trying to be civil too. Goodbye, Mr. Rutherford." She closed the door. She stood with her hand flat against it for 3 full seconds, listening to the sound of them on the porch, and then the creak of the boards as they stepped down, and then nothing. She turned around and found Clement Holloway standing in the hallway 10 feet behind her. She had not heard him come downstairs. He had a stillness when he needed it that was remarkable in a man his size. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the smile, not the easy equanimity he usually wore, but something quieter and more serious, with a focused quality that made her think of the way he watched horses he was trying to understand. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly fine," she said, which was true. Her hands were completely steady and she was not afraid of Dax Rutherford because she had decided some time ago that fear of men like him was a luxury she could not afford. "They will be back," she added. "They always come back. Do you want me to?" "No," she said. "I do not need you to do anything about the Rutherfords. Pearl Haskell is my guest and her situation is my concern." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said, "but you might find it useful to know that I have met Dax Rutherford before, 3 years ago near Uvalde. He is not someone who responds well to being told no and then left to sit with it. I am aware of what kind of man he is." "I am sure you are." Again the quality of real belief in it, not condescension. "I am just saying, if the circumstances change, and you decide you want someone to stand in the second row while you handle things your way, I can do that." She looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the end of the hallway, and it lit the side of his face in a way she did not particularly want to spend time noticing. "I will keep that in mind," she said, and went back to the kitchen. She thought about what he had said for the rest of the evening. The phrasing of it specifically. Not that he would handle it for her, not that he would take over, that he would stand in the second row while she handled things her way. It was such a precise and unusual thing for a man to say that it stayed with her the way a particular word sometimes does when you encounter it for the first time and realize you had needed it without knowing. Pearl Haskell was in the kitchen when Theresa went back in, quietly washing dishes with her two boys already asleep on the cot in the storeroom. She was a slight woman, fine-boned, with a quality of endurance that expressed itself not in hardness but in a kind of patient steadiness, like a tree that has weathered enough seasons to know the storm's end. "I heard," Pearl said. "They will not come into the house," Theresa said. "You cannot protect me forever. I am not trying to protect you forever. I am trying to give you enough time to figure out your next step." Theresa took up a dish towel and began drying beside her. "Have you written to your people in Louisiana?" "Brother wrote back last week. He is trying to arrange passage money. Another 3 weeks, maybe 4. "Then we have 4 weeks, Theresa said. "That is manageable." Pearl looked at her sideways. "You make everything sound like something that can be organized." "Most things can be," Theresa said. "The ones that cannot, you handle differently." Pearl smiled slightly, the way people smile at something that comforts them even when they are not entirely sure it should. "That man upstairs," she said. "The cowboy. Mr. Holloway. He spoke to Dax Rutherford's men in town yesterday. I saw from the window of the store." Rutherford's man, the one with the red beard, was asking questions about the boarding house and who was staying here, and Mr. Holloway redirected him toward the subject of horses for about 20 minutes until the man forgot what he had been asking about. Theresa set down the dish she was drying and looked at Pearl. "Did he?" "He did. I thought you should know, in case you did not already." Theresa thought about this information and the specific feeling it produced in her chest, which was something she was not going to examine closely in the middle of a Tuesday evening kitchen with wet dishes on the counter. "He did not mention it to me," she said. "No," Pearl said. "I do not think he would." The next morning, Theresa was in the kitchen at 5:30 when she heard Clement's boots on the stairs. She had the coffee already made and 2 cups on the table, which was not something she had planned exactly, or at least had not planned consciously, but which was nonetheless what she had done. He came in, and he stopped when he saw the 2 cups, and he looked at her, and she said, before he could speak, "You are still impossible about the mud. But I heard about what you did in town with Rutherford's man." He looked at the cups again and then pulled out a chair and sat down. "I did not do much." "You redirected a man asking dangerous questions for 20 minutes. "I talked about horses for 20 minutes, he said. "That is not a hardship for me." She poured the coffee and sat across from him. The kitchen was still dim, the window showing the pale beginning of the sky outside, and the house was completely quiet above them. It was the earliest they had been in the same room at the same time, and there was something different about the quality of the silence between them in that hour, less guarded, the way people are when they are not yet fully awake and still know to perform the usual distances. "Why did you do it?" she asked. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment, turning it slightly in his hands. He had large, capable hands, marked with the specific calluses of rope and leather. "Because Pearl Haskell is a woman in a difficult situation that is not of her making, and I did not like the direction that conversation with Rutherford's man was heading." "That is it." He looked up at her. "And because you had closed the door on Dax Rutherford the day before without flinching, and I thought that was worth something." Theresa Sutton did not blush easily. She was not a woman who had spent much of the past several years in circumstances that permitted blushing. But something in her face did something she could not entirely control, and she looked down at her own coffee cup and was glad the kitchen was still dim. "The Rutherford family has a long reach in this county," she said, because it was the practical thing to say and she was a practical woman. "If they decide to make this a genuine problem, Sheriff Deering will not be much help." "I know it," he said. "Do you have anyone else in town who would stand with you if it came to that?" She thought about it honestly. Porties at the livery stable, Doc Whitfield, Mrs. Carver at the general store, who would at minimum make their lives commercially inconvenient. She paused. The Reverend Ambrose would pray very sincerely, which has not yet proven to have immediate practical effects, but I include him for completeness. He laughed. It was a real laugh, low and genuine, and it entirely changed the landscape of his face, the way sunlight changes a valley. She had not heard him laugh before, not fully, and she found it was something she would not object to hearing again. 4 weeks, he said. Pearl thinks so. I can stay 4 weeks, he said, not offering exactly, just stating a fact about where he would be. She looked at him across the table and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Your breakfast will be ready in 40 minutes, and got up to start the eggs, and he sat at the table and drank his coffee in the particular easy companionable silence of a man who knows when talking would ruin something. After that morning the cups were always 2 at breakfast. Neither of them mentioned it. Lily, Theresa's daughter, had formed her own opinion of Clement Holloway within approximately 48 hours of his arrival, which was that he was interesting in the specific way that 7-year-old Lily Sutton found things interesting, which was to say she followed him around at a careful distance and watched him with large dark eyes and occasionally asked him direct and disarming questions. "How come your horse is so much bigger than the other horses?" she asked one afternoon, having apparently concluded that introductions were optional. Clement was brushing down his bay in the small paddock behind the boarding house, the afternoon bright and warm around them. He looked at Lily with the same focused attention he gave to things he was genuinely thinking about. "Because I raised him from a foal," he said, "and I let him eat properly and exercise enough when he was young. You get out of a horse what you put in, mostly." "Like people," Lily said. He thought about that. "Something like it," he agreed. Lily climbed up 2 rungs of the fence and studied the horse with the intense proprietary air of a child forming a relationship. "What is his name?" "August." "Why August?" "I got him in August, when I was 22 years old, and I had not yet learned to give animals better names than the month I acquired them." Lily considered this seriously. "You could rename him." "I could," Clement agreed, "but he has learned his name now and changing it seems unkind." Lily nodded as though this was exactly the right answer. "Mama says you are impossible," she offered. "Your mama is usually right about most things," he said. "She says it every morning," Lily said, "but she does not say it like she means it." Clement looked at the child and then looked back at the horse with a careful expression that was, had Lily been a few years older, recognizable as the face of a man trying very hard not to reveal something. "Is that so?" he said. "She used to say things like that about Papa," Lily said, "before he died. She would call him the most stubborn man in the state of Texas, and then she would be smiling when she said it." Clement was quiet for a moment, his hand moving steady and unhurried over the horse's flank. "Your papa sounds like he was a good man," he said. "He was," Lily said. "His name was Robert. He died of fever when I was 4. I do not remember him very well, but Mama keeps a photograph." She said all of this with the frank, practical honesty of a child who has processed grief in the way children do, entirely and then completely, and kept the facts without the wound. "Are you going to leave after 4 weeks?" she asked, pivoting without transition the way children do. "That is my current plan," he said. "Mama's plans change sometimes," Lily said, in a tone that was so entirely neutral it conveyed exactly the observation she was making without any overt suggestion. Clement looked at her then, and Lily met his gaze with perfectly composed 7-year-old serenity. And then she climbed down from the fence and went back toward the house, and Clement stood in the paddock and stared at the place where she had been standing for a somewhat longer time than the situation would normally require. It was in the 3rd week that things shifted between Theresa and Clement in a way that could not afterward be pretended had not happened. The Rutherfords came back. It was a Wednesday evening, late enough that supper was done and the house had settled into its night rhythms, Pearl's boys asleep, Lily in her room with a lamp and a book she was reading by syllabling along to herself, the way Theresa could hear through the wall when she passed. Theresa was at the desk in the small parlor that served as her household office, going through accounts, when she heard the sound of horses on the road and then boots on the porch. It was not just Dax this time. It was all three brothers and four of their men, which was a different kind of visit. Theresa did not go to the door immediately. She sat at her desk for a moment and thought clearly about what she had and what she needed, the way she had learned to think in the difficult years after Robert died, when clear thinking had been the difference between the boarding house surviving or not. Then she stood up, straightened her skirt, and went to the door. Dax was in front. His brothers, Cole and Whit, stood behind him. The four ranch hands were spread behind them in a way that was probably meant to look casual and did not. "Mrs. Sutton," Dax said, "we are past the pleasantries. We know Pearl Haskell is in this house. I want her brought out so we can settle this matter." "The matter," Theresa said, keeping her voice even and clear, "is under advisement by my solicitor in Austin." This was not precisely true. She had written to a solicitor in Austin, but had not yet received a response. But it was the kind of statement that had a slowing effect on men who were operating in the gray area of the law. "I would advise you strongly against taking any action tonight that complicates your legal standing." "I do not have a problem with my legal standing," Dax said. "I have a debt that wants collecting." "Under Texas law," said a voice behind Theresa, "a debt contracted by a deceased husband does not automatically pass to a widow in cases where the widow can demonstrate the debt was disputed prior to the husband's death." Theresa did not turn around. She had heard Clement's footsteps on the stairs while she was walking to the door and had known he was there. Dax Rutherford's eyes moved from Theresa to the space behind her shoulder. "This your business, Holloway?" "I am a guest in this house," Clement said. He had come to stand just behind and to the side of Theresa, not in front of her, which was the exact placement of the man who had said he would stand in the second row. "Making the boarding house difficult is making my business difficult. So yes, I would say it is adjacent to my business." "You would do well to stay out of what does not concern you," Dax said. "You would do well to take 7 men away from a woman's house at 10 in the evening before the good people of this town form any opinions about what you are doing here," Clement said. He said it in a completely reasonable tone, as though he were discussing livestock prices, and that reasonableness was somehow more precise and effective than anger would have been. "Harrow Creek has a wire service now. Word about certain kinds of behavior travels considerably faster than it used to." There was a silence. One of the ranch hands shifted his weight. Dax Rutherford looked at Clement with the specific focused assessment of a man calculating odds. 3 weeks, Dax said finally. "I am telling you she has 3 weeks to settle this account or make arrangements. After that, I will be pursuing this through whatever channels are available to me." "We will note the date," Theresa said. Dax held her gaze for a moment with an expression that she recognized as a man who is accustomed to winning and is deferring the win rather than abandoning it. Then he stepped back, and his men stepped back with him, and they rode out of the yard. Theresa stood in the doorway until the sound of them was entirely gone. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door and turned around, and Clement was standing in the hallway. For a moment neither of them spoke. He was in his shirt and suspenders, having apparently come from upstairs in a hurry, and his hair was loose from his hat and his eyes were steady on her face. "You knew about the Texas law," she said. "I read," he said. "I spend a lot of time on the road. Books are light to carry." She looked at him. She was aware of the full quiet of the house around them, the lamplight in the hall, the fact that she was standing close enough to him that she could see the specific detail of his face without any effort at all, and that the thing that had been sitting in her chest for 2.5 weeks was not going to stay still any longer. "Clement," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and she watched him register it. "Theresa," he said, equally quietly, which was the first time he had used hers. "I am going to say something practical," she said. "All right. I am not in the habit of feeling things for men who are passing through," she said. "I am particularly not in the habit of feeling things for men who are going to San Angelo at the end of the month. So what I would like to know, and I am asking directly because I do not have the time or the temperament for any other approach, is whether you have a reason to consider that your plans might not be entirely fixed." He looked at her for what felt like a very long moment and was probably 3 seconds. "I have had a reason since about the fourth morning," he said. "When you called me impossible and then handed me the mop and watched me use it with an expression that suggested you might, in fact, have been arguing with yourself about being amused." She blinked. "I was not amused." "You were a little amused," he said, and there it was, the smile, the real one, starting at the corners of his eyes. She looked at him with an expression that was holding several things at once and not resolving them into anything neat or manageable. "You are still impossible," she said. "I know it," he said. "Good night, Theresa." He went back up the stairs, and she stood in the hallway with her hand over her mouth, and something she finally recognized as happiness moving through her chest like water finding a path it had not used in some time. The next morning she came down to find him already at the kitchen table with the coffee made and 2 cups poured, which had been her job for the past 2 weeks, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said a word about the previous evening. She sat down. She picked up her coffee cup. "You are impossible," she said. He smiled. He opened the newspaper he had apparently ridden to the general store to collect before first light, because it was Mrs. Carver's delivery day, and he knew she liked to read it, and he spread it on the table between them so they could both see it. It was the first time she noticed that the morning greeting had stopped being a complaint and become something else entirely. The complication arrived 4 days later in the form of a letter from the solicitor in Austin, which was good news bundled inside difficult news, the way most legal correspondence manages to be. The solicitor confirmed that Pearl Haskell's case against the Rutherford debt had strong grounds under recent Texas statutes, and that he could pursue it formally, but it would take time they did not have, given that Dax Rutherford's 3-week countdown was already running. Theresa sat at her desk and read the letter twice and then went to find Clement, who was in the paddock with August, doing something she had no name for involving a long lead rope and the horse's gait that appeared to require absolute concentration. She waited at the fence until he brought the horse around to her, and then she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. He handed it back. "He needs a retainer to file," he said. "More than I can pull from the boarding house accounts right now," she said. "Pearl has nothing." He was quiet for a moment, the horse shifting gently beside him, August's large dark eye calm and curious. "I have some saved," Clement said. "From the work in Uvalde." She looked at him. "Absolutely not. It would be a loan," he said. "Pearl can repay it when she is settled in Louisiana and back on her feet. People do repay loans occasionally. Clement, Theresa." He said her name in a way that was patient and direct and somehow conveyed without elaboration that he had thought about this, and it was not an impulsive offer, and he wanted her to hear the decision behind it rather than argue with the surface of it. "I have the money. The use for it is here. The math is simple." She looked at him for a long moment, at the steadiness of him, the complete absence of performance or expectation in the offer. This was a man who fixed the fence latch and talked about horses for 20 minutes and stood 2 steps back and called it being in the second row, and she thought that she had known him for less than a month and felt more seen by him than she had by most people in years. "I will tell Pearl it is a loan," she said, "and she will repay it." "I know she will," he said, "and you will let me handle the letter to the solicitor." "I would not have it any other way," he said. She wrote the letter that afternoon and sent it with the funds by the next day's post. The reply came within 10 days. The solicitor had filed. The Rutherfords had been notified through proper legal channels, and the dubious nature of the debt had been placed formally on record. Dax Rutherford could pursue it in court if he chose to, but the cost and publicity of doing so would be considerable, and men like Dax Rutherford calculated costs carefully when they had to calculate them in public. He did not pursue it. He sent no further men to the boarding house. The 3-week deadline passed like a cloud going over, leaving no storm behind it. Pearl Haskell's passage money from her brother arrived 3 days after that. She left Harrow Creek on a Monday morning in a wagon bound for the eastward stage, her 2 boys in clean shirts, her face carrying the particular expression of a woman who has been frightened for a long time and is only beginning to believe it might be over. She hugged Theresa in the yard with a fierceness that communicated everything she could not quite organize into words. She shook Clement's hand and then, apparently reconsidering, hugged him too, which he received with the good grace of a man who understands why someone needs to do a thing. Lily, watching from the porch, waved until the wagon was out of sight. That evening after supper, Theresa found herself sitting on the porch in the cooling air, and Clement sat down beside her in the second chair. There were 2 porch chairs, and she had not wondered until this moment why she had 2 of them when she mostly sat alone, and they watched the last of the light go out of the sky together. "She will be all right," Clement said. "Yes," Theresa said, "she will." "You did that," he said, "the whole of it. You helped." "I stood in the second row," he said. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the sky, the last colors of it, and his face in profile was a thing she felt some complicated fondness for that she was not entirely managing to organize into anything sensible. "That is not nothing," she said. "That is actually quite a lot." He turned and looked at her, and the evening was quiet around them, just the beginning sound of the night insects starting up and the distant sound of a dog somewhere on the far end of town, and he said, "I have been thinking about San Angelo." "Have you?" she said. "The contracted work is real," he said, "but it is not a permanent arrangement. It is a season's work, and after that I am at liberty." "I see," she said. "I have also been thinking," he said, "that a boarding house in a growing town has a certain amount of infrastructure that could use ongoing attention. Fences, porch steps, possibly the roof, which appears to have a soft spot over the east corner that will be a problem by winter." She looked at him. "You have been inspecting my roof." "I notice things," he said. "The roof," she said slowly, "is not the most romantic thing you could have led with." He turned to face her more fully, and his expression was everything and more than the smile. It was all of it, the seriousness and the warmth and the particular quality of attention she had never quite experienced directed at herself before. "Theresa Sutton," he said, "you are the most capable, most determined, most deeply impractical romantic I have met in my entire life, and I would very much like to come back to Harrow Creek after San Angelo if you will have me." She looked at him for a long moment. "I would like you to state your intentions clearly," she said, "because I have a daughter and I do not bring unclear situations into her life." "My intention," he said, "is to come back from San Angelo and ask you to marry me. I am telling you now so that you have the time between now and then to tell me if that is not something you want, and I will respect it entirely, and we will not speak of it again. But I thought you deserved the honest statement of it." She was quiet. The night had fully come in around them now, the stars beginning their slow appearance in the Texas sky overhead, thick as thrown salt, the way they only appeared when the land was dark enough for miles in every direction. "Lily is fond of you," she said finally. "I am fond of her," he said. "She is exceptional." "She is," Theresa agreed. "She is also 7 years old, and she has had exactly one parent for most of her life, and it would need to be done properly. Gently." "I know it," he said, "and I am not a woman who is easily managed or redirected," she said. "I think you have noticed that." "It is one of my favorite things about you," he said. She looked at the sky. She breathed. She let herself feel the full shape of the thing she was feeling, which was large and warm and slightly terrifying in the specific way that hope is when it has been absent for some time and has now returned unexpectedly during lambing season. "Go to San Angelo," she said. "Do your work, come back." "And then," he said, "and then you may ask your question," she said, "and I will give you my answer when you ask it." He nodded, and they sat for a while longer on the porch in the dark, not quite touching, not needing to, the distance between them both real and entirely comfortable, which is its own kind of closeness. In the morning she came down to the kitchen and heard his boots on the stairs and called, before he even reached the bottom, "You are impossible, Mr. Holloway," and his voice came back. "Good morning, Mrs. Sutton." And she stood at the stove and felt something settle in her like a house putting its foundation down for good. He left for San Angelo on a Friday, which she had always considered the only reliable day of the week. He shook her hand in the yard formally, in front of Lily and Mrs. Carver from the general store, who happened to be passing and would notice everything and tell everyone, which was simply how life in Harrow Creek operated. He tipped his hat. He swung up onto August. He rode out of the yard and down the road toward the western edge of town, and Theresa stood in the yard and watched him go until she could not see him anymore, and then she went back inside and put the coffee cups away, both of them together in the same cabinet, which was different from how she had stored them before, and went to her desk and opened her accounts book and made herself think about practical things. Lily appeared in the doorway of the parlor. "When is he coming back?" she asked. "After summer," Theresa said without looking up. "Are you going to marry him?" Lily asked in the same tone she used to ask what was for supper. Theresa looked up. "Why do you ask that?" "Because," Lily said with the infallible logic of a 7-year-old, "you are nicer to him than you are to other people." "I am nice to plenty of people," Theresa said. "You are polite to plenty of people," Lily said, which was a distinction Theresa found startlingly accurate for a second grader. "You are nice to him. It is different." Theresa looked at her daughter, this small certain person who had her own dark eyes and Robert's stubborn cowlick, and an interior compass that pointed unerringly toward the true thing. "Go and feed the chickens," Theresa said. Lily went, looking satisfied. Theresa sat at her desk and found she was not looking at the accounts book anymore. The summer of 1874 in Harrow Creek was long and hot, and full of the various events that fill long hot summers in small Texas towns. A dispute between two ranching families over a fence line that required the Reverend Ambrose to intervene before the sheriff had to. A flash flood in July that took out the bridge on the eastern road and kept the stage from running for 2 weeks. A traveling medicine show that set up in the open lot beside the livery stable and was tolerated for 4 days before Porties asked them to move on because the noise was bothering his horses. Theresa kept the boarding house running and took in 2 new boarders, a land surveyor named Gibbs who was methodical and quiet and ate enormous amounts at every meal, and a schoolteacher named Miss Dorning, who was 23 years old and tremendously enthusiastic about everything, which made her a bracing presence at the breakfast table. Lily liked Miss Dorning very much, and had apparently decided that learning every word in the dictionary was a reasonable project for a summer. Theresa received 3 letters from Clement over the course of the summer. They were not love letters in the traditional sense. They were not flowery or elaborate. They were accounts of what he was doing, the horses he was working with, a funny thing that happened during a crossing of the Concho River, a description of a sunset over the hills west of San Angelo that went on for a full paragraph with a precision and attention to color that told her something about him she had not known, which was that he saw the world with the same focused care he brought to everything else. Each letter ended with the same 3 words, "Until I return," she wrote back. She was not a flowery writer either. She told him about the flood and the medicine show and Lily's dictionary project, and the soft spot in the roof over the east corner, which Porties had agreed to look at, but had not yet looked at. She described a morning when Auguste's paddock had been temporarily occupied by 3 loose goats from somewhere north of town, and she had spent 45 minutes returning them to their unknown owner, and felt obscurely that she owed him an accounting of the paddock's welfare. She did not end her letters with 3 words. She ended them with her name, simply, and then usually crossed it out and wrote it again more clearly because her handwriting when she was tired was not her best work. His last letter from San Angelo arrived in late September. The work was finishing ahead of schedule. He would be back in Harrow Creek by the 2nd week of October. She read it at breakfast, alone at the kitchen table, both cups of coffee in front of her. She set the letter down. She picked up the 2nd cup and looked at it for a while. Then she went to find Lily. "He is coming back in October," she said. Lily looked up from the dictionary. She was on the D's. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "Drink your milk," Theresa said. He arrived on a Wednesday, which was exactly as unreliable as she remembered. She was in the yard hanging laundry when she heard Auguste's distinctive footfall on the road. She had learned to distinguish it over the summer, which was information she was choosing not to examine, and she turned with a sheet still in her hands. And he was riding through the gate exactly as he had the first time, in the worn canvas coat and the battered hat. And his face when he saw her was the smile before it became a smile, the moment just before. He swung down from Auguste. He took off his hat. He walked across the yard to where she was standing with the sheet in her hands, and he stopped a reasonable and appropriate distance from her. "Hello, Theresa," he said. "You are late," she said. "It is Wednesday. I know it. The road from El Dorado was slower than I planned." "You are still impossible," she said. He smiled, fully the real version. "Hello," he said again, as though the first time had been practice. "Hello," she said back, which was different from every other time they had said it. He looked at her for a moment, this woman with a sheet in her hands and a look on her face that was containing about 17 things at once, and then he said, "I have a question I mentioned I would ask." "You mentioned it," she agreed. "The answer does not need to come today," he said. "I know it has been months and things can change in months, and if your thinking has changed, I would understand completely." "Clement," she said. "Yes. Ask the question." He took a breath. He looked at her with a straightforwardness that was entirely characteristic of him, no artifice, no performance. "Will you marry me?" he said. "You and Lily, in whatever arrangement makes sense for your lives and your house and everything you have built here. I am not asking you to change anything about what you are. I am asking to be in it." She looked at him for 3 full seconds, standing in the yard with the laundry around her and the October sky overhead, warm gold and blue, the air smelling of sun-dried cotton and the first hint of the coming autumn cool. "Yes," she said. "Obviously," he blinked. "Obviously. I have had both coffee cups out every morning for 4 months," she said. "What did you think that meant?" He laughed, and it was the same real laugh as the first time. And it was also entirely different because this time she did not turn away from it. They married in November, in the church with the leaking roof, which had been partially repaired by then. Clement had borrowed tools from Porty's and spent 3 days up there in the second week of October, and the east corner was solid now, though the west side still wanted work in spring. The Reverend Ambrose performed the ceremony with great warmth and only slightly excessive length. Miss Dorning, who had been invited and was moved by nearly everything, required 2 handkerchiefs. Mrs. Carver from the general store sat in the front row, with the satisfied expression of a woman whose observations have been vindicated. Porty's attended in his best shirt and smelled only faintly of horse liniment. Doc Whitfield stood as witness. Gibbs the surveyor, who was still boarding and had become unexpectedly fond of the household, also attended and shook hands with everyone twice. Lily wore a blue dress Theresa had made from material she had been saving since August, and she stood beside them at the altar with a small bouquet of autumn wildflowers she had collected herself, and an expression of complete composed confidence in the correctness of the proceedings. When the Reverend Ambrose said that Clement could kiss his bride, Clement took Theresa's face between his large, careful hands and kissed her with great gentleness in front of the entire town of Harrow Creek, and Theresa kissed him back without any hesitation whatsoever, which Lily decided was the most satisfying conclusion to a dictionary project she had yet encountered, though she acknowledged that she was only on the D's. That evening, after the small celebration that Mrs. Carver had largely organized and insisted on holding in the general store's back room, she had produced a remarkable amount of food from somewhere, and the origins of the cake remained a subject of admiring speculation. Theresa and Clement walked back to the boarding house in the dark with Lily half asleep between them, her hand in each of theirs, her feet doing the tired shuffle of a child who has eaten too much celebration cake. Theresa unlocked the front door. Lily drifted upstairs to her room with the slightly miraculous self-navigation of the very young and very exhausted. The house was quiet around them. Clement stood in the hallway in his good coat. He had acquired a good coat for the occasion, which was very nearly the same worn canvas coat but with the button properly reattached, and looked at Theresa in the lamplight. "I will fix the west side of the roof in spring," he said. "I know you will," she said, "and I have been thinking about the paddock. With the right management we could keep a proper small string here. 2, maybe 3 horses that I could be working while the boarding house runs. The income from training work would be steady." "You have been planning," she said. "I think ahead," he said. "I find it useful." She crossed the hallway to him and took the lapel of his good coat in her hand and said, "Clement." "Yes. You can tell me about the paddock tomorrow," she said. He looked down at her, this woman who had called him impossible every morning and handed him the mop, and sat across from him with 2 coffee cups, and written him letters about goats, and closed the door on Dax Rutherford without flinching, and raised a remarkable small person entirely on her own. And he thought that there was no fact in his life that felt more exactly right than the fact of being in this hallway with her. "All right," he said, and he kissed her again, and this time there was no one watching and no leaking roof and nothing required of either of them except this, which was more than enough. The years that followed in Harrow Creek were not without their difficulties, because life in a Texas town in the latter half of the 1870s was not a smooth or effortless business. There were hard winters and droughts, and the ongoing complicated relationship between the growing railroad and the ranching communities it both served and disrupted. There was the particular difficulty of 1876, when a fever went through the county and Theresa and Clement spent 3 weeks running the boarding house as an informal auxiliary to Doc Whitfield's practice, managing 4 sick boarders at once while simultaneously trying to keep Lily from the rooms that were quarantined, which Lily found extremely unreasonable and argued against with impressive rhetorical force. There was the matter of Clement's reputation as a horse trainer, which grew steadily and brought him work from increasingly distant ranches, which meant he was sometimes gone for a week or 2 at a stretch during the busiest seasons, and which Theresa accommodated with the same organized practicality she brought to everything, and which he made up for by writing letters that were longer and better every year. His descriptions of the country he moved through becoming something she looked forward to with a specific pleasure she had never had reason to expect from correspondence. There was also the matter of the injustices that ran through the fabric of the territory like old thread, the ways in which certain families and certain names and certain amounts of money continued to operate with impunity in ways that the law was slow to address, if it addressed them at all. Theresa saw it clearly, the way the world tilted towards some and away from others, and it made her careful about who she let board in her house and why, and Clement understood this about her and loved her for it, and between them they quietly helped when they could, which was more often than people expected. They had their first argument about 6 months after the wedding, which was a furious and detailed disagreement about whether the boarding house kitchen needed a new stove, and which model was the appropriate choice, and which lasted 3 days and was resolved when Clement conceded that Theresa's operational knowledge of what the kitchen needed was superior to his theoretical preference. And Theresa conceded that his judgment about the structural question of whether the floor could support the heavier model was correct, and they ordered the stove she wanted installed per his specifications, and it worked perfectly for 23 years. They had their second argument about whether Lily needed to attend the new school that had opened in the larger town 15 miles east, and this one lasted longer and was harder because both of them were entirely right from their own positions. Theresa from the position of a mother who understood what education meant for a daughter in 1877, and Clement from the position of a man who had watched Lily calculate feed ratios in her head at age 9, with the casual accuracy of someone who had been thinking mathematically since before formal instruction was available. They resolved it by finding out that the new school accepted boarding students from the surrounding towns and Lily could attend during the week and come home weekends, which was not what either of them wanted but was what Lily herself, consulted on the matter, said she wanted, in a firm and organized speech that made Clement look at Theresa with an expression of pure helpless recognition. "She gets that from you," he said. "She gets that from herself," Theresa said. "But some of the vocabulary is yours." In the autumn of 1878, Theresa told Clement she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, with 2 cups of coffee between them, which was where they told each other most of the important things. He looked at her across the table for a moment without speaking, and then he got up and came around the table and knelt beside her chair. This large, quiet man with the capable hands and the hat he was not wearing because it was morning and he was in the kitchen. And he held her hands in his and said nothing at all for a moment, just looked at her. And what was in his face was everything he would have said if he had been a different kind of man, and he had not already learned that saying less and meaning it entirely was worth more. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. He stayed kneeling there, holding her hands, for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she let him. Their son was born in the spring of 1879, on a morning in April when the countryside outside Harrow Creek was making its annual argument that the world was capable of great beauty if you gave it the right conditions. He was a vigorous and opinionated infant from approximately his first hour, which Theresa said she was not in the least surprised by, and Clement said he could not think who he took after with a straight face. They named him George, after Clement's father, who had been a good man in his time and would have been glad of the knowledge that his son had found a home worth keeping. George Holloway had Theresa's dark eyes and Clement's tendency to watch things carefully before deciding what to do about them, and an absolute certainty about his own feelings on any given subject that expressed itself in volume during the first 2 years of his life, and thereafter in a more manageable but equally determined form. Lily came home from school the weekend after George arrived and sat on the edge of the bed where Theresa was resting with the baby and studied her new brother with the focused attention of someone examining a significant development. "He is very small," she said. "He will not stay small," Theresa said. "No," Lily agreed. She reached out and put one finger against George's palm and watched with something quiet and warm in her face when he gripped it automatically. "Does he have a name?" "George," Clement said from the doorway. Lily considered this. "That is a solid name," she said, with the authority of a 12-year-old who had recently completed the dictionary through the letter M. "We thought so," Clement said. Lily looked at her stepfather and Clement looked at his stepdaughter, and between them there passed the kind of wordless communication that develops between people who have watched each other carefully for years and learned what the other's silences mean. She smiled at him briefly, the real kind. He smiled back. "Are you hungry?" Theresa said from the bed. "Always," Lily said, and went to the kitchen, and Clement followed her, and the house held all of them in its kept and solid rooms. In the years after George, the boarding house grew, or rather, it evolved, as businesses in growing towns tend to, following the shape of the need around it. By 1882, Harrow Creek had acquired a second general store, a telegraph office, a new school of its own that made Lily's Eastern schooling moot by about 3 years too late, and an increased population of families following the railroad lines into the territory. Theresa expanded the boarding house into the adjacent lot she had purchased quietly in 1880, knowing the land would matter eventually, and added 4 more rooms that were consistently occupied. Clement's horse training business had grown to the point where he had 2 young men working with him part-time, teaching them what he knew with the same patient, focused attention he brought to the horses themselves. He was, by his early 40s, regarded as among the best in the region at the specific work of taking difficult or damaged horses and returning them to usefulness, and ranchers came from considerable distances with animals that other trainers had given up on. He still fixed things around the boarding house. The west side of the roof, addressed in the spring of 1875 as promised, had been solid for 7 years. The fence latch had been replaced twice, the second time with a mechanism of Clement's own devising that Theresa said was probably overcomplicated, and which worked perfectly and had not stuck once in 4 years. He had built a proper reading room off the parlor in 1881, when Theresa mentioned in passing that she had been wanting a place for the boarders to sit with books in the evenings, and had finished it in 3 weeks of careful weekend work, and it was the room she liked best in the house. Theresa herself had become, by 1882, something of a quiet institution in Harrow Creek. She was on the committee for the new school's curriculum, a position she took seriously and pursued with the same organized relentlessness she brought to everything. She was the person women in difficult situations found their way to, word passing through certain networks in the way it does in small towns, quietly, reliably, only to those who needed to know. She did not advertise this. She simply did it, and Clement knew she did it, and there was never a conversation about whether he would support it because his support was a fact the way the solid roof and the well-fitted fence gate were facts. They had their second child, a daughter, in the autumn of 1883. Theresa had said she was finished after George, and she had meant it sincerely at the time, and life had arranged itself otherwise, which she accepted with the pragmatism she brought to all arrangements that deviated from her plans. They named the girl Ruth, which was Theresa's mother's name, and which she had promised herself long ago she would use if she ever had the occasion. Ruth was born with a full head of pale hair that looked nothing like either of her parents, and exactly like Clement's younger sister, whom Theresa had met once and immediately liked, and she had a quality of stillness in early infancy that made the attending doctor comment that she seemed like a child who was waiting patiently to see how things turned out. Like her father, Lily said, who was 16 by then and home for the autumn. Like herself, Theresa said, but she looked at Clement and he was looking at the baby with the same quiet, focused attention he gave to things he was trying to understand, and she thought Lily was probably also right. In the mornings of those full years, nothing changed about the particular morning greeting that had been theirs since the first weeks in 1874. It was embedded in the rhythm of the household, now the way a river is embedded in a valley. You could not imagine the land without it. Clement would come down the stairs from wherever he had been up early doing whatever required being done before first light, and Theresa would hear his boots and call from the kitchen, the stove or the counter or the table, "You are impossible, Mr. Holloway," and his voice would come back, "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," and the kitchen would settle into the particular warmth of two people who know each other well enough that their ordinary words carry the weight of everything they have not bothered to say because it has been understood for years. The children absorbed this exchange the way children absorb the furniture of their household, as simply the way things are, unremarkable bedrock. George, at 7, did at one point ask his mother why she called his father impossible every morning. Theresa considered the question. "Because he is," she said. "But you smile," George said. "I know," she said. George considered this. "Are impossible people good?" he asked. "The best ones are," she said, and George accepted this and went back to whatever he had been doing, which was attempting to teach the yard cat to do something the yard cat had no intention of doing, which was its own kind of instructive experience. Lily had married in 1887, at 20 years old. His name was Thomas, and he was a quiet, intelligent man who worked in the telegraph office and read more books than Theresa had thought possible, until she remembered that she had raised the girl, and it should not have been a surprise. He was the kind of man who listened carefully and said less than he could have, and was genuinely excellent when anything needed thinking through, and Theresa liked him very much. Clement had watched Thomas with horses for about 20 minutes and told Theresa privately that any man who could sit still near a horse he did not know and wait for the horse to decide he was trustworthy was a man with the right fundamental character, and Theresa had agreed that this was an accurate method of assessment. Lily and Thomas settled in Harrow Creek because Thomas's work was there, and because Lily, for all her education and wide curiosity, had decided that Harrow Creek was her town, and she was going to help it become what it should be. She was, by the late 1880s, a formidable presence at the school board meetings, and the kind of person who made things happen through the application of organized and relentless good sense, which Theresa had observed with deep satisfaction, and said nothing about because some observations are too important to speak. They had their first child in 1888, a boy they named Robert after Lily's father, which made Theresa sit very still for a moment when she heard it, and then press her lips together and look at Clement, who was standing beside her, and he put his hand over hers without speaking. The boarding house continued. The rooms were full more often than not. The town around it changed, grew, shifted, developed the complicated character of places that exist at the intersection of old ways and new. The cattle culture, and the coming of the railroad and the telegraph, and all the machinery of a country figuring itself out through the second half of the 19th century. Theresa watched it all with the same dark eyes that missed nothing and managed accordingly. In the evenings, when the boarders had retired and George and Ruth were in their rooms, and the house was settling into its nighttime sounds, Theresa and Clement sat on the porch. They had added a third chair at some point, for Lily when she visited, but on the evenings when it was just the two of them they used their two chairs, and the space between was comfortable and known. They talked about practical things mostly. The boarding house, the horses, George's school progress, which was good and occasionally spectacular in mathematics, Ruth's latest project, which changed monthly and had included, variously, learning to identify every bird in the county, teaching herself to play the old piano in the parlor, attempting to document the weather patterns of Harrow Creek by systematic daily observation, and a current sustained interest in the question of why certain plants grew in some places and not others that was beginning to look like it might be a genuine aptitude rather than a passing enthusiasm. But they also, on those porch evenings, sat in the comfortable silence of people who have spent years in the same house and know that silence can hold as much as words, and sometimes more. "Do you remember," Theresa said one evening in the autumn of 1889, 15 years after the beginning of it all, "the first morning you tracked mud across my kitchen floor? I remember you were waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs," he said. "I was not waiting," she said. "I happened to be there. You had the mop in your hand," he said. "I was going to use it regardless." He smiled. The smile had changed over 15 years the way all real smiles do, become more settled, more deeply itself, all the layers of what had accumulated in the years behind it present in it without having to be stated. "You called me impossible," he said. "You were impossible," she said. "I still am," he said. "I know," she said. "I rely on it." He looked at her in the evening light, this woman who was 43 years old and had the same strong, capable hands and the same dark eyes that missed nothing and had added, in the 15 years, a quality he thought of as completion. Not that she had been incomplete before, not that, but as though everything she had already been had been given the room and the company to become fully itself. "Theresa," he said. "Yes. I love you," he said. It was not the first time he had said it. He said it regularly, in the specific unshowy way he did everything, as a statement of clear fact rather than performance. "I want you to know that I am aware with some frequency of how fortunate I am." She looked at him for a moment. "You tracked mud on my floor for 6 straight days," she said. "I did," he agreed. "You are still impossible," she said. "I know," he said. She reached across the space between the chairs and put her hand in his, which was something they had been doing for 15 years but which still had a specific warm quality of choice about it, as though each time they were choosing it again, which perhaps they were. They sat like that as the evening went dark and the stars came out over Harrow Creek, thick and unhurried, the way they had come out over this particular piece of Texas, since long before any of this town was here and would continue long after. And beneath them, two people who had found each other in the unreliable way that people do, through mops and fence latches and 20 minutes of talking about horses, and the particular morning grammar of calling someone impossible and meaning something entirely different. George came in 1891 to tell them he intended to study veterinary medicine in San Antonio, which he had researched thoroughly and presented as a fully organized plan with consideration of the costs and timeline and expected outcomes. And Theresa looked at Clement, and Clement looked at Theresa with the helpless mutual recognition of two people who have watched their son become himself and find the result both entirely surprising and entirely inevitable. "All right," Theresa said. "He has the aptitude for it," Clement added, which George received with the satisfaction of someone who had been hoping for exactly that assessment from exactly that source. Ruth, who was now 8, listened to the whole conversation from the hallway with the patient observational quality she had possessed since birth, and then went back to her window, where she was currently tracking what she believed to be a change in the behavior of the barn sparrows that might be correlated with changes in barometric pressure, a hypothesis she was testing with methodical daily records. Harrow Creek in 1892 was a town of settled character, not large enough to be impersonal but grown enough to have the complexity of a real community. Its arguments and its loyalties and its history and its ongoing negotiation with the world it was part of. The boarding house sat on its street like something that had always been there, because it had been there long enough that the younger residents of Harrow Creek had never known it to be otherwise. Theresa ran it with the same organized capability she always had, though she had help now, a young woman named Clara who had come to board 3 years ago and stayed to work in the house when it became clear she had a gift for management that was being wasted elsewhere. Clara was 24 and direct and efficient and reminded Theresa, occasionally, of the woman she herself had been at 24, and she felt for this a particular tender recognition. Clement at 51 was as much in demand as he had ever been, perhaps more so, because the reputation he had built over nearly 2 decades was the kind that accrued rather than diminished. He could work horses in a way that other trainers still came to watch, and he taught anyone who wanted to learn without making the teaching into a transaction. He was, in the way of men who have been consistently themselves for a long time, simply the shape of who he was, known and knowable and entirely without pretension about it. He still made the mud prints on the kitchen floor. Not always, and not with the regularity of those first weeks in 1874, but often enough that it had become a fixture, a familiar note in the household. And every time Theresa heard his boots on the stairs and called him impossible, and he answered her with the morning, the children, George when he was home, Ruth at the table, Lily when she visited, had the experience of witnessing something that was both entirely ordinary and, if you knew to look, entirely extraordinary. Two people speaking their particular language, the one they had built out of the specific materials of their own lives, which did not translate exactly into any other language, but was completely clear between the two of them. On a November morning in 1894, exactly 20 years after Clement Holloway had ridden into Harrow Creek on a bay horse with mud on his boots and asked about a room, Theresa was in the kitchen before sunrise. She had the stove going and the coffee made. She heard his boots on the stairs. He had been up early, she knew, because she always knew, the sounds of this house as familiar to her as her own breathing. She did not call to him before he reached the kitchen. She waited. He came through the door. He stopped when he saw her standing at the stove with her back to him, and then she turned and looked at him. This man she had called impossible for 20 years, who had fixed her fence and her roof and stood in the second row and written her letters about sunsets and knelt beside her kitchen chair with her hands in his, and slept beside her and argued with her and laughed with her and sat with her on the porch in the dark of every season watching the stars come up. And she said, "You are impossible." He crossed the kitchen and he kissed her, right there at the stove in the full light of the early morning, which was not something that required an occasion. "Good morning," he said against her hair. "Good morning," she said. She poured the coffee. They sat down at the table together, the table that was scarred and worn and had held 20 years of breakfasts and arguments and letters and plans, and the particular silence of two people who know each other well enough to need very few words. And the kitchen was warm, and the house around them was full of everything they had made together. And outside the window Harrow Creek was beginning its morning in the November light, and it was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, her pale hair in a braid, 8 years old still in the rounded way of sleep. She looked at her parents at the table. She looked at the coffee. She looked at the light outside. "Is there breakfast?" she asked. "There will be breakfast," Theresa said. Ruth climbed into the third chair and leaned her elbows on the table, and watched the light change at the window with the calm observational patience that was entirely her own. And Clement reached over and tugged gently on her braid, and she batted his hand away without looking. And Theresa watched both of them and felt the specific texture of the feeling that had no single name but was made of gratitude and dailiness, and the accumulated weight of ordinary mornings, which is the heaviest and most sustaining weight there is. She picked up her coffee cup. She looked at Clement across the table. "You are still impossible," she said. He smiled. He was always going to smile. That was the thing about Clement Holloway. Every morning when she said it, no matter what the morning held, he smiled because she was there to say it, which meant she was there, which was the only thing that had ever mattered. And she was. She always was.